The morning sun spilled across the wide porch of the ranch house, warming the wooden boards and catching dust motes in its golden light. The old actor sat in his favorite chair, a cup of coffee cooling beside him on the small table. His weathered hands held the day's newspaper, though his eyes weren't focused on the words. Instead, they gazed out across his property, taking in the rolling California hills that stretched toward the horizon. At 79, he still maintained the straight-backed posture and careful movements that had defined his on-screen presence for decades. His face, lined with age and experience, still carried that famous squint that had intimidated countless film villains. But today, something was bothering him. A car approached along the private road, sending a plume of dust into the morning air. He recognized it as belonging to Tom, his property manager, who wasn't scheduled to visit until next week. The actor folded his newspaper and stood, his movements deliberate but not stiff. Years of horseback riding and staying active had kept him in better shape than most men 20 years his junior. "Morning," he called out as Tom climbed from the car, a leather briefcase in hand and an unusual expression on his face. "Morning, boss," Tom replied, climbing the porch steps. "Sorry to drop by unannounced." The actor nodded toward the chair beside his. "Coffee's fresh." Tom shook his head. "I can't stay long. Got something you need to see." He pulled an envelope from his briefcase and handed it over. "This came to the business office yesterday." The actor took the envelope, noting the official seal of the county court in the corner. His expression didn't change as he opened it and pulled out the formal document inside. His eyes moved methodically over the text, taking in the legal language. "It's about the water rights dispute," Tom explained unnecessarily. "The Hendersons are pushing forward with their claim that your East Creek diverts water from their property." The actor grunted softly. The Hendersons had purchased the neighboring ranch last year and immediately began making noise about boundaries and water rights that had been settled decades ago. "They're asking you to appear in court next Tuesday," Tom continued. "I've already called Richard. He says he can handle it if you don't want to deal with it personally. Just needs you to sign some paperwork." Richard was the attorney who had handled the actor's legal matters for the past 30 years. The actor refolded the document and slipped it back into the envelope. A court appearance wasn't how he'd planned to spend his Tuesday, but something about the situation irked him. The Hendersons had been difficult neighbors from day one, wealthy tech industry folks who'd moved to the country with romantic notions about ranch life, but none of the practical knowledge or respect for local ways. "I'll go," he said. Finally, Tom's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You sure? Richard can—" "I'll go," the actor repeated, his voice quiet but firm in the way that had silenced movie sets for generations. "Been defending this land for 40 years. Not about to stop now." Tom nodded, knowing better than to argue. "I'll let Richard know. He'll still want to meet with you beforehand." After Tom left, the actor remained on the porch thinking. He rarely made public appearances these days unless it was for one of the charities he supported or the occasional film project that caught his interest. He valued his privacy and the quiet life he'd built here. His phone rang inside the house. He made no rush to answer it, finishing his now cold coffee before heading inside. The caller ID showed his daughter's number. "Hey," he answered, his voice softening slightly. "Dad, Tom just called me. Is it true you're going to court over that water dispute?" He smiled slightly. His daughter had always been protective of him, especially as he aged. The role reversal amused him. "It's nothing to worry about," he assured her. "Just need to set some things straight." "You know how people get when you appear in public," she reminded him. "There'll be press, fans. It'll be a circus. Why not let the lawyers handle it?" He moved to his kitchen window, looking out at the creek that was the subject of the dispute. It flowed clear and steady, as it had since before he'd purchased this place in the early 1980s. He remembered bringing his children here when they were young, teaching them to fish in that very creek. "Some things a man needs to do himself," he said simply. His daughter sighed on the other end of the line. "At least let me come with you." "I appreciate that," he replied, "but I can handle this." After hanging up, he walked through his house to his office. Unlike many celebrity homes, his was relatively modest and distinctly personal, decorated not with awards or movie memorabilia, but with Western art, family photos, and keepsakes from his decades of ranching. He'd never cared much for the glitz of Hollywood, preferring solid craftsmanship and functionality. He sat at his desk and opened the bottom drawer, pulling out a folder of documents related to the property. He knew every inch of his land, had walked it, ridden across it, and cared for it personally. The Hendersons' claim was baseless, but they had money and lawyers who were willing to pursue weak cases if the fee was right. The next morning, Richard arrived at the ranch. The attorney had aged alongside his famous client, his hair now white and his movements a bit slower, but his mind was as sharp as ever. "You really don't need to appear in person," Richard said after they'd reviewed the case. "Your presence will turn a simple property dispute into a media event." The actor poured them both a small measure of whiskey, despite the early hour. "Some conversations called for it." "I've been thinking about that," he replied, settling into his chair. "Might not be a bad thing." Richard raised an eyebrow questioningly. "The Hendersons want attention. They like telling their friends they live next to me." The actor took a small sip of his whiskey. "But they won't like the attention they get when people find out they're trying to bully an old man off his water rights." Richard chuckled. "Old man? Is that how you see yourself?" The actor's lips twitched in the barest hint of a smile. "Not how I see myself. How they see me, and how the public will see this case." Over the next few days, the actor prepared for his court appearance. He reviewed the property maps with Richard again and dug out old photographs that showed the creek's path had remained unchanged for decades. On Monday evening, his son called. "You sure about this, Dad? I can fly in tomorrow morning and go with you." "No need to change your schedule," the actor replied, touched by the offer but determined to handle this himself. "How are the kids?" They talked about family matters for a while before his son circled back to the court appearance. "Just try not to intimidate everyone like you usually do," his son said, half joking. The actor made a non-committal sound that might have been a laugh. His on-screen persona had always been intense and somewhat intimidating, and he knew that carried over into how people perceived him in real life. He rarely bothered to correct those impressions, finding that they often worked to his advantage. Tuesday morning arrived clear and cool. The actor rose at dawn, as was his habit, and went through his normal routine. He fed his horses, checked a fence that needed repair, and then came back to the house to dress for court. He chose a simple gray suit, well-tailored, but not flashy, with a light blue shirt and a dark tie. He didn't dress up often these days, preferring jeans and work shirts, but he understood the importance of presentation. Looking in the mirror, he straightened his tie and noted that, despite his age, he still cut a formidable figure. Richard arrived to drive them to the courthouse. "Ready for this?" "There were already 2 news vans in the parking lot when I drove past." The actor nodded, unsurprised. News traveled fast in small towns, and a celebrity court appearance, even for something as mundane as a property dispute, was bound to attract attention. As they drove through the countryside toward town, the actor gazed out at the landscape. This land had been his refuge for 4 decades, the place he returned to between films, where he'd raised his children and now entertained his grandchildren. "It was worth fighting for." "You know," Richard said, breaking the silence, "the judge is new to the district, only been on the bench about 6 months. Name's Holloway." The actor nodded but said nothing. He didn't particularly care about the judge's background. His case was solid. When they arrived at the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered outside. As Richard had warned, several news crews were setting up equipment, and a handful of onlookers were clearly hoping for a glimpse of the famous actor. Richard pulled around to a side entrance. "Thought this might be easier," he explained. The actor nodded gratefully. He had no interest in running a gauntlet of cameras and questions before the hearing even began. Inside, they were directed to a small conference room to wait. Through the window in the door, the actor could see the Hendersons and their attorney in the hallway. Mr. Henderson was gesturing animatedly while speaking to a reporter, clearly enjoying his moment in the spotlight. The actor turned away from the door and sat quietly, gathering his thoughts. In a few minutes, he would walk into that courtroom and face whatever awaited him there. At his age, he had learned that preparation was important, but so was the ability to adapt to unexpected situations. And somehow he had a feeling that today would bring something unexpected. The courthouse was an imposing stone building that had stood in the center of town since the 1930s. Its high ceilings and polished wooden benches gave it a timeless gravity that newer buildings could never match. As the actor and Richard waited, the hallway outside their conference room grew increasingly noisy with footsteps and voices. A court clerk, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, knocked and entered. She did a double take when she saw the actor, then quickly composed herself. "We're ready for you now, gentlemen," she said, her voice professional despite the slight widening of her eyes. "The Henderson case is first on the docket this morning." The actor nodded and stood, buttoning his suit jacket. Richard gathered their documents and followed as the clerk led them down the hallway toward the courtroom. "There's quite a crowd," the clerk said over her shoulder. "Word got around that you'd be here today." The actor made no response. He'd been dealing with public attention for over 50 years, and had learned that acknowledging it only invited more. As they approached the courtroom doors, he could hear the buzz of conversation from inside. The clerk pushed open the heavy wooden door, and the noise immediately hushed as heads turned toward the entrance. The actor paused for just a moment in the doorway, his eyes taking in the scene. The courtroom was nearly full. In addition to the usual court personnel, there were reporters with notepads, curious locals, and even a few obvious tourists hoping to spot a celebrity. At the front of the room, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson sat beside their attorney, a young man in an expensive suit who was leaning over to whisper something to his clients. Without hurry or hesitation, the actor walked down the center aisle toward the tables at the front. His gait was measured and dignified, neither rushing nor dawdling. He kept his eyes forward, ignoring the whispers and stares that followed him. "Is that really him? He looks older in person." Still has that walk, though. Richard stayed close behind, carrying their folder of evidence. They took their seats at the plaintiff's table, the actor settling into the wooden chair with the same quiet command he brought to every room he entered. Across the aisle, Mr. Henderson was trying not to stare but failing miserably. His wife was less subtle, openly watching the actor while whispering to their attorney. They were in their early 40s with the polished look of people who spent a lot of money to appear effortlessly stylish. The husband had the confident posture of someone accustomed to getting his way, while his wife had perfected a look of perpetual mild disappointment with her surroundings. The actor focused on arranging his papers, seemingly oblivious to the attention, though in reality he missed nothing. He'd spent decades observing people, their mannerisms, their tells, their moments of authenticity and pretense. It made him both a skilled actor and someone difficult to deceive. "All rise," the bailiff called out suddenly, and everyone in the courtroom stood as the door to the judge's chambers opened. Judge Holloway entered briskly, a man in his mid-50s with a receding hairline and wire-rimmed glasses. He moved to the bench and sat down, gesturing for everyone else to be seated as well. "Good morning," he said, looking down at the papers before him. "We're here for Henderson versus..." He paused, glancing up and doing a slight double-take as he recognized the defendant. If the actor had been watching for it, he would have seen the moment of surprise flicker across the judge's face before being replaced with a carefully neutral expression. "Henderson versus Eastwood Properties," the judge continued, recovering quickly. "A dispute regarding water rights on adjacent properties. Mr. Henderson is the plaintiff, represented by Mr. Collins. The defendant is present and represented by Mr. Tanner." The actor sat quietly, his face impassive. Years of shooting westerns had taught him the power of stillness, of saying more with silence than others could with a flood of words. Judge Holloway shuffled some papers, then looked at the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Collins, please present your case." The Henderson's attorney stood, straightening his tie. He was somewhere in his 30s, with the eager demeanor of someone still trying to make a name for himself. "Thank you, Your Honor. My clients purchased their property 14 months ago and since then have experienced a significant reduction in the water flow to the natural spring on their land. Upon investigation, they discovered that the neighboring property, owned by the defendant, has a creek that has been artificially altered to divert water away from its natural course, which would otherwise feed the spring on my client's land." The actor listened without visible reaction, though the corners of his eyes tightened slightly at the blatant misrepresentation. That creek had flowed along the same path since before he bought the property, before his grandparents were born, for that matter. Collins continued, presenting aerial photographs and property maps as evidence. He spoke with the confidence of someone who believed that volume and assertiveness could compensate for a weak argument. As he talked, he occasionally glanced toward the actor, perhaps hoping for some reaction that would betray concern or frustration. He received none. The actor sat calmly, occasionally leaning over to murmur something to Richard, who would nod and make a brief note. The courtroom audience seemed divided between those watching the legal proceedings with interest and those simply staring at the famous defendant. A few had even managed to sneak phones in despite the court rules and were attempting to discreetly take photos. After 20 minutes of presentation, the judge turned to Richard. "Mr. Tanner, your response?" Richard stood buttoning his suit jacket. Unlike Collins, he moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had argued hundreds of cases and knew the value of precision over showmanship. "Your Honor, my client has owned his property for 41 years. The creek in question has followed the same path for at least a century, as we can demonstrate with survey maps dating back to 1923. Richard placed the first of several documents on the evidence table. Furthermore, the spring on the Hendersons' property has always been seasonal, flowing strongly after winter rains but diminishing during dry months. This pattern is documented in the property disclosures that were provided to the Hendersons when they purchased the land." Richard continued methodically, building a case based on historical documents, geological surveys, and the testimonies of neighbors who had lived in the area for generations. Unlike Collins, he didn't attempt to dazzle with rhetoric but instead laid out facts in a clear, straightforward manner. Throughout Richard's presentation, the actor maintained his composed demeanor, occasionally nodding slightly in agreement but otherwise remaining still. His eyes, however, never stopped observing, noting the judge's reactions, the Hendersons' growing discomfort, the shifting mood of the courtroom. When Richard concluded, Judge Holloway removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I'd like to hear from the property owners directly," he said. "Mr. Henderson, please take the stand." Mr. Henderson walked to the witness stand with the confident stride of someone used to being in charge. After being sworn in, he settled into the chair and adjusted his designer tie. "Mr. Henderson," Collins began, "please tell the court about your experience since purchasing the property." Henderson leaned slightly toward the microphone. "My wife and I bought the ranch as a weekend retreat. The listing specifically mentioned a year-round spring that would be perfect for the gardens my wife wanted to plant and the small vineyard we planned to develop. But by late summer, the spring was barely a trickle. We contacted water experts who traced the source and determined that the natural flow was being diverted by the creek on the neighboring property." The judge listened attentively, occasionally making notes. When Collins finished questioning his client, he looked to Richard. "Your cross-examination, Mr. Tanner." Richard approached the witness stand. "Mr. Henderson, before purchasing the property, did you review the historical water flow data that was included in your disclosure packet?" Henderson shifted uncomfortably. "We reviewed everything our realtor gave us. And did you consult with any local agricultural experts about the feasibility of maintaining a vineyard on that property with its existing water resources?" "We spoke to a landscaping company from the city," Richard nodded. "A company with experience in rural water management and local soil conditions?" Henderson hesitated. "They had excellent reviews online." A few muffled chuckles came from the local residents in the audience, quickly silenced by a look from the bailiff. Richard continued his methodical questioning, gradually revealing that the Hendersons had made assumptions based on a brief visit during the rainy season and ambitious plans that ignored the realities of the local environment. When Richard finished, the judge called for the defendant to take the stand. The actor rose and walked to the witness stand with the same unhurried dignity that characterized all his movements. The courtroom fell completely silent as he was sworn in, his gravelly voice resonating clearly as he promised to tell the truth. The actor settled into the chair, his posture straight but relaxed, his weathered hands resting lightly on the rail in front of him. He appeared neither intimidated by the formal setting nor overly comfortable in it, just a man prepared to speak his piece. As Richard began his questioning, the actor responded in his characteristic measured tones, his answers direct and unembellished. He described his decades on the property, the careful stewardship he had practiced, and the unchanged course of the creek that was now in dispute. There was no grandstanding, no attempt to leverage his celebrity, just the straightforward testimony of a landowner defending his rights. After Richard finished his questions, it was Collins' turn for cross-examination. The younger attorney approached the witness stand with a slight swagger, clearly relishing the opportunity to question such a famous figure. So, Collins began, you've been a Hollywood star for what, 60 years now? Objection, Richard called immediately. Relevance. Judge Holloway leaned forward. I'm curious where this is going, Mr. Collins. Relevance? I'm establishing the witness's background and primary occupation, Your Honor. It goes to his knowledge and experience in land management. The judge nodded. I'll allow it, but keep it focused on relevant matters, the actor answered evenly. My first film role was in 1955. My first starring role was in 1964. And throughout your career, you've played a lot of tough guys, correct? Cowboys, police officers, soldiers. I've played various roles, the actor replied simply, including many characters who take the law into their own hands. Collins pressed. Objection, Richard said again, more forcefully. Counsel is conflating fictional roles with the witness's real life. Sustained, Judge Holloway agreed. Mr. Collins, the witness's acting roles are not relevant to this case. Collins adjusted his approach. Let me ask you this. How much time do you actually spend on your ranch? Given your career and other commitments, isn't it possible you're not aware of changes made to the property? The actor's expression remained unchanged, but his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. I've lived on that ranch for over 40 years. I've walked every acre of it countless times. I know every hill, every tree, and every bend in that creek. But surely you employ people to manage the property when you're away filming or attending events. I have a property manager who helps with maintenance. But I've been semi-retired for some time now. The ranch is my home, not a vacation property. Collins picked up a document from his table. Your production company filed permits for a film shoot on the property last year that lasted 3 months. You were away during that time, correct? I was present for most of that shoot. It was a small project, but not monitoring the creek daily. The actor's patience was visibly thinning, but his voice remained controlled. The creek hasn't changed its course in the 40 years I've owned the property, Mr. Collins. Not during film shoots, not during droughts, not during floods. Collins switched tactics again. Let's talk about your expertise. You played a rancher in films, but what formal training do you have in hydrology or water management? At this, Judge Holloway let out a small chuckle, shaking his head slightly. The sound was barely audible, but in the hushed courtroom it carried. Several audience members glanced at each other, surprised by the judge's apparent amusement at the actor's expense. The actor turned his steady gaze to the judge, who was now trying to compose his expression. Something funny, Your Honor? The actor asked quietly. The judge cleared his throat. No, please continue, Mr. Collins. But Collins had noticed the opening and pressed ahead. I think what His Honor recognizes is the irony of someone who made millions pretending to be a rancher, or a cop, now presenting himself as an expert on water rights. The actor didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at the judge, waiting. Judge Holloway seemed to take the silence as an invitation. I think what Mr. Collins is trying to establish, rather clumsily, is that playing roles on screen doesn't necessarily translate to real-world expertise. It's a fair question, though perhaps not relevant to whether the creek changed course. The actor nodded slowly. I understand the distinction, Your Honor. I'm not claiming expertise based on roles I've played. The judge leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Though I have to admit, some of those roles were quite convincing. The tough lawman, the uncompromising sheriff. I particularly enjoyed that film where you played the Secret Service agent protecting the president. What was it called again? A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The judge seemed to be enjoying himself now, building a rapport with the audience at the actor's expense. The actor remained still, his expression unchanged. In the line of fire, he said simply. That's it, the judge said, snapping his fingers. Great film. You looked so natural with that badge and gun, almost like the real thing. Another wave of laughter, louder this time. The actor glanced at Richard, who looked concerned about the direction the proceedings were taking. Your Honor, Richard began, I must object to this line of... But the actor raised a hand slightly, silencing his attorney. His gaze returned to the judge. With respect, Your Honor, we're here to discuss water rights, not my filmography. Judge Holloway nodded, still smiling. Of course, you're right. My apologies for the digression. But his tone suggested he wasn't entirely serious. Please continue, Mr. Collins. Collins, emboldened by the judge's apparent alliance, pressed on. My point is simply that managing land and understanding water systems requires actual knowledge, not just playing pretend. The Hendersons hired experts who confirmed that water was being diverted. The actor shifted slightly in his seat, his patience clearly being tested. Those experts visited during the dry season, after an unusually hot summer. The spring has always reduced its flow during those conditions. So you're saying you know better than certified hydrologists? Collins asked with exaggerated incredulity. Judge Holloway chuckled again. Mr. Collins, while I appreciate your enthusiasm, I think we've established that Mr. Eastwood is not claiming to be a hydrologist. He's simply testifying to his observations as a property owner. The judge turned to the actor. Though I must say it's refreshing to see someone of your stature taking such a hands-on approach to a mundane matter like this. Most celebrities would have sent an army of lawyers instead of appearing personally. There was something in the judge's tone, a subtle condescension, as if he were both impressed and amused by the actor's presence. The actor studied the judge for a long moment before speaking. I've always believed in handling important matters personally, Your Honor. Admirable, the judge replied, not entirely sincerely. Very much like one of your characters might do. This time the actor didn't let the comment pass. You seem very focused on my acting career, Judge Holloway. The judge spread his hands. It's not every day we have Hollywood royalty in this courtroom. I'm a fan, I admit it. I appreciate that, the actor said, his voice dropping to that familiar gravelly whisper that had captivated audiences for decades. But there's a difference between the roles I've played and who I am. Of course, the judge agreed quickly, though his smile remained. Though sometimes it's hard to separate the two. You've played so many authority figures so convincingly. The lines blur, don't they? The courtroom had grown uncomfortably quiet. Everyone could sense the tension building between the actor and the judge. Speaking of authority figures, Collins interjected, trying to regain control of his cross-examination. Would you say your celebrity status gives you more influence in local matters than your neighbors? The actor didn't take his eyes off the judge as he answered. I've always tried to be a good neighbor and a responsible citizen. My property rights are the same as anyone else's, no more, no less. Judge Holloway leaned forward. But surely you must acknowledge that your fame gives you certain advantages in disputes like this. People are naturally inclined to believe the famous figure they admire. The actor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Is that what you think is happening here, Your Honor? That I'm using my name to intimidate my neighbors? The judge shrugged slightly. I'm simply acknowledging the reality of celebrity influence. It's nothing to be embarrassed about. We all use the advantages we have. Something shifted in the actor's demeanor, a subtle change that nevertheless commanded attention. Without raising his voice, he somehow seemed to fill the courtroom with his presence. Your Honor, may I approach the bench? The request, unexpected at this juncture, caused the judge to pause. He glanced at both attorneys, then nodded. Very well. The actor rose from the witness stand and walked to the bench with measured steps. Richard joined him, as did Collins, both attorneys looking confused by this deviation from procedure. When they were all gathered before the bench, the actor reached slowly into his jacket pocket. The movement was deliberate, giving no cause for alarm, but it drew everyone's attention. You mentioned in the line of fire earlier, the actor said quietly, so only those at the bench could hear. While preparing for that role, I worked closely with the United States Secret Service to understand their procedures and responsibilities. He withdrew his hand from his pocket, now holding a small leather wallet. With a practiced movement, he flipped it open to reveal a badge and identification card. After the film, in recognition of my efforts to portray their work accurately and respectfully, I was made an honorary agent of the Secret Service. It's largely ceremonial, but I've maintained relationships with the agency ever since, supporting their charitable foundation and occasionally speaking at their events. Judge Holloway stared at the badge, his expression freezing as the color drained slightly from his face. The smug amusement that had animated his features moments before was suddenly gone, replaced by something closer to embarrassment. I don't mention this publicly, the actor continued, his voice still low and controlled. It's not something I use for publicity or leverage. But I thought, since you were so interested in the connection between my film roles and real life, you might appreciate knowing that sometimes those connections run deeper than they appear. The judge swallowed visibly, then nodded. I appreciate you sharing that information. Shall we get back to the matter of the creek now? The actor suggested, returning the badge to his pocket. Yes. Judge Holloway agreed quickly, straightening in his chair. Yes, let's do that. As the actor returned to the witness stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. Judge Holloway sat up straighter, his earlier casual demeanor replaced by attentive professionalism. The spectators sensed the change without knowing its cause, an undercurrent of curiosity rippling through the rows of seats. Collins looked confused by the sudden shift. He glanced at his clients, who shrugged slightly, then at the judge, whose expression gave nothing away. "Mr. Collins," the judge said, his voice noticeably more formal, "you may continue your cross-examination." The young attorney cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor." He shuffled his notes, having lost his momentum during the bench conference. "Mr. Eastwood, you mentioned earlier that the spring on my client's property has always been seasonal." "How could you know that if you've never owned their property?" The actor's response was measured. "Because I considered purchasing that parcel when it came up for sale in the late 80s. I had it thoroughly surveyed, including water assessments. I have copies of those surveys, which Mr. Tanner has submitted as evidence." "And why didn't you buy it?" "The seasonal nature of the spring made it less suitable for my needs at the time. I was raising horses then and needed more reliable water sources." Collins frowned, realizing this line of questioning wasn't going as planned. "But you can't testify to how the spring has behaved in recent years before my clients purchased the property." "Not personally," the actor conceded. "But the previous owner, Bill Taylor, provided an affidavit, which was also submitted as evidence. He owned that property for 27 years and documented the spring's seasonal patterns." Collins looked increasingly frustrated. He conferred briefly with the Hendersons, who whispered urgently to him. Mrs. Henderson in particular seemed agitated, gesturing toward the actor with obvious displeasure. "Let's approach this from another angle," Collins said finally. "Isn't it true that your property sits at a higher elevation than my client's, and that water naturally flows downhill? Parts of my property are at a higher elevation, yes. So if water is diverted on your property, it would affect properties downstream, correct?" The actor nodded. "In theory, yes. But the creek in question flows east to west across my property, not north to south toward the Hendersons. Their spring is fed by underground water that comes primarily from the hills to the north, which neither of us owns." Judge Holloway was following the testimony with careful attention now, his earlier amusement completely gone. He occasionally made notes and studied the property maps that had been submitted as evidence. Collins tried another approach. "Mr. Eastwood, since you purchased your property, have you made any alterations to the land? Any construction, landscaping, or other changes that might have affected water flow?" "I've built structures, my house, barns, a few cabins for guests, added some access roads, installed fencing for the horses. Nothing that would alter the course of the creek or underground water flow. No wells drilled, no irrigation systems installed. There's one well near the main house drilled in 1984. It's more than a mile from the property line we share with the Hendersons. I have an irrigation system for a small vegetable garden near the house, also far from their property. Both were properly permitted." Collins turned to consult with his clients again. Mr. Henderson seemed to be arguing for a particular question, while his wife shook her head in disagreement. After a moment, Collins turned back to the witness. "Mr. Eastwood, isn't it true that you had extensive landscaping done around your property 3 years ago, including the area near the creek?" The actor thought for a moment. 3 years ago, we had to remove some fallen trees after a winter storm. We also reinforced the creek banks in a few places where erosion was becoming a problem." "Reinforced how?" "Natural stone barriers to prevent further erosion. All done with proper permits from the county," Judge Holloway interjected. "Are those permits part of the evidence, Mr. Tanner?" Richard nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. They're included in Exhibit D along with the environmental impact assessment that was conducted before the work began." The judge nodded, making another note. Collins looked increasingly desperate, his confident demeanor from earlier now completely gone. He flipped through his notes rapidly, searching for another angle. "Let me be direct. Mr. Eastwood, my clients believe that your creek reinforcement project altered the natural water flow in a way that diverts water from their spring. They've suffered damages as a result. Plants dying, increased water delivery costs, decreased property value." "I understand their frustration," the actor replied, surprising everyone with the gentleness in his tone. Being new to ranching and discovering that water sources don't behave as expected can be disappointing. But the reinforcement project was specifically designed to maintain the natural flow, not alter it. The environmental assessment confirmed that it would have no impact on neighboring properties. Collins opened his mouth to ask another question, then closed it again. He looked at his clients, who were whispering heatedly to each other. Finally, he said, "No further questions." "Your Honor." The actor stepped down from the witness stand, returning to his seat beside Richard with the same quiet dignity he'd shown throughout the proceedings. Judge Holloway studied both parties for a moment. "Does the defense have any additional witnesses?" Richard stood. "Yes, Your Honor. We've brought in Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a hydrologist who has studied the water systems in this region for 20 years. She can speak to the seasonal patterns of the springs in the area and the factors that affect their flow." The judge nodded. "Call your witness." As Dr. Rodriguez was sworn in, the actor noticed Mr. Henderson leaning over to whisper something to his wife. She shook her head firmly, her expression troubled. Henderson then whispered urgently to his attorney, who looked surprised and then concerned. Dr. Rodriguez, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun, gave clear technical testimony about the water systems in the region. She explained how the drought conditions of the previous summer had affected groundwater levels throughout the county, causing many seasonal springs to diminish earlier than usual. She presented data from multiple properties showing similar patterns to what the Hendersons had experienced. "In your professional opinion," Richard asked, "could the reinforcement work done on the creek at my client's property have affected the spring on the neighboring property?" "No," she answered definitively. "The creek and the spring are part of different water systems. The creek is surface water flowing east to west, while the spring is fed by an underground aquifer that flows from north to south. Changes to one would not impact the other." Throughout her testimony, the actor observed the Hendersons closely. Mrs. Henderson looked increasingly uncomfortable, while her husband appeared frustrated and occasionally angry. They continued to whisper to each other and their attorney, their body language suggesting disagreement. When it was Collins' turn to cross-examine the hydrologist, he seemed less enthusiastic than before. His questions were perfunctory, almost as if he were going through the motions without believing in his case anymore. After Dr. Rodriguez stepped down, Judge Holloway asked, "Any further witnesses from either side?" Both attorneys indicated they had no more witnesses to call. "In that case, I'll hear closing arguments. Mr. Collins, you may proceed." Collins rose and delivered a closing argument that lacked the confidence of his opening. He still maintained that the Hendersons' spring had been affected by changes on the neighboring property, but he emphasized different points now, suggesting that perhaps the effects had been unintentional, or that both parties might have misunderstood the complex water systems involved. When it was Richard's turn, he methodically reviewed the evidence, the historical maps showing the unchanged course of the creek, the environmental assessments confirming no impact on neighboring properties, the expert testimony explaining the separate water systems, and the data showing countywide effects of recent drought conditions. "Your Honor," he concluded, "the evidence clearly shows that my client has not diverted water or altered the natural flow in any way that would affect the plaintiff's property. Their spring is behaving exactly as it has for decades, flowing strongly after winter rains and diminishing during dry months. The plaintiff's expectations were simply not aligned with the reality of rural water systems in this region." As Richard returned to his seat, Mr. Henderson suddenly stood up. "Your Honor, may I address the court?" Judge Holloway looked surprised. "Mr. Henderson, you're represented by counsel. If you wish to speak, it should be through your attorney." "Please, Your Honor," Henderson insisted. "This is important." The judge glanced at Collins, who reluctantly nodded. "Very well, but keep it brief." Henderson stepped forward, looking uncomfortable but determined. "I want to withdraw our complaint." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Mrs. Henderson closed her eyes briefly, her expression a mixture of relief and resignation. "Mr. Henderson," the judge said carefully, "are you sure you understand what you're doing? Once dismissed, this matter cannot be brought before the court again." "I understand, Your Honor," Henderson replied. "The truth is, my wife tried to tell me this wasn't the right approach. We bought the property with certain expectations, and when reality didn't match those expectations, I looked for someone to blame." He glanced at the actor. It was easier to blame the famous neighbor than to accept that we might have made a mistake. The actor's expression remained neutral, but his eyes showed a hint of understanding. Henderson continued. After hearing the testimony today, especially from the hydrologist, I realize we were wrong. The spring is behaving naturally. We just happened to buy during a wet season and then experienced a dry one. He turned toward the actor. I apologize for the accusations and for wasting everyone's time. Judge Holloway looked at Collins. Counsel, do you concur with your client's decision to withdraw? Collins nodded, though he didn't look happy about it. Yes, Your Honor. Very well. The judge turned to the actor and Richard. Do you have any objection to the dismissal of the complaint? Richard looked to the actor, who gave a slight nod. The attorney stood. No objection, Your Honor. We appreciate Mr. Henderson's candor. The actor himself remained seated, his expression thoughtful but not triumphant. There was a quiet dignity in his restraint that spoke louder than any victory speech could have. Judge Holloway cleared his throat. Very well. The complaint is hereby dismissed with prejudice. He struck his gavel once, the sound echoing in the now silent courtroom. Court is adjourned. As people began to rise and the buzz of conversation filled the room, the judge added, Mr. Eastwood, Mr. Tanner, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, and Mr. Collins, I'd like to see all of you in my chambers briefly. The request raised eyebrows among the court staff and spectators, but the 5 people gathered their things and followed the bailiff toward the judge's chambers. The actor moved unhurriedly, nodding politely to a few people who caught his eye but not stopping to engage. This wasn't a movie premiere or a public appearance. It was a private matter now concluded. The judge's chambers were paneled in dark wood, with law books lining one wall and a few tasteful photographs on another. A large desk dominated the space, with a seating area off to one side consisting of a small sofa and several chairs. Judge Holloway gestured for everyone to take a seat in this area while he remained standing. I wanted to speak with you all privately, the judge began, his tone noticeably different from the one he'd used in the courtroom earlier. First, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, I commend your decision to withdraw the complaint. It takes character to admit when you've made a mistake. The Hendersons nodded, though Mr. Henderson still looked uncomfortable. The judge turned to the actor. And Mr. Eastwood, I owe you an apology. My behavior in the courtroom was unprofessional. I allowed my personal feelings about your work to affect my judicial demeanor. The actor nodded once, accepting the apology without comment. As for the matter at hand, the judge continued, while the complaint has been withdrawn, I think there might be a more productive way forward for all parties. He looked at the Hendersons. You purchased your property with certain expectations about its water resources. Those expectations weren't met, not because of any wrongdoing by your neighbor, but because of natural conditions and perhaps a lack of proper disclosure by the previous owner or the real estate agents involved. Mrs. Henderson spoke up for the first time. We did feel somewhat misled about the spring. The property was shown to us in March when everything was green and the spring was flowing beautifully. No one mentioned it might dry up by August. The judge nodded. That might be grounds for a different legal action, though I'm not suggesting more litigation. What I am suggesting is a neighborly solution. He glanced at the actor. Mr. Eastwood, you've managed your property successfully for decades. Would you be willing to share some of that knowledge with your new neighbors? Help them understand the seasonal patterns and how to work with them, rather than against them? The actor considered this for a moment. I'd be willing to do that, he said finally. The land in this valley has its own rhythms. Learning to work with them takes time. Mr. Henderson looked surprised. You'd do that? After we accused you of diverting water and dragged you into court? The actor's mouth quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Neighborly disputes are part of ranch life. Water's always been a contentious issue in these parts. Has been since before any of us were born. Perhaps, the judge suggested, Mr. Eastwood could show you some of the water management systems he's developed on his property. And Dr. Rodriguez mentioned during her testimony that there are grants available for water conservation projects. You might qualify for assistance in developing more reliable water sources. The Hendersons looked at each other, a silent communication passing between them. Mrs. Henderson spoke. We'd appreciate that. We bought the property because we love the land, but we clearly have a lot to learn about managing it. I know a thing or two about being the new folks in town, the actor said, his gravelly voice gentle. Took me years to earn the trust of some of the old-timers when I first moved here. They thought I was just another Hollywood type playing at being a rancher. Mrs. Henderson smiled. Is that why you're willing to help us? Because someone helped you? The actor nodded. Old Bill Jenkins owned the property next to mine back then. Could have made things difficult for me, but instead he shared what he knew. Taught me about the land, the weather patterns, which crops would thrive and which wouldn't. Made all the difference. Judge Holloway looked pleased with how the conversation was going. Well, I think this is a much better outcome than any court ruling could have provided. Neighbors helping neighbors, that's what rural communities are built on. As the meeting concluded, the judge asked to speak privately with the actor for a moment. The others filed out, with the Hendersons and Richard discussing potential dates for a visit to each other's properties. When they were alone, Judge Holloway looked distinctly uncomfortable. About that badge, he began. The actor waited, saying nothing. I'd appreciate if that didn't become public knowledge. My behavior was inappropriate enough without adding that I was put in my place by an honorary Secret Service agent. It won't come from me, the actor assured him. Like I said, it's not something I talk about much. The judge nodded gratefully. May I ask, how many people know about it? Not many outside the service itself. It's not exactly a secret, but it's not something I've ever used for publicity. I have to admit, I'm curious about how it came about. The actor considered for a moment, then decided to share the story. During filming, I spent time with several agents, learning how they operate, how they think. One of them, a 20-year veteran named Thompson, became a good friend. A few years after the film, he was diagnosed with leukemia. The service was holding a benefit for him and his family, and they asked me to attend. The judge listened intently as the actor continued. I went, of course. Made a donation. But they had a surprise for me, too. Thompson had apparently put my name forward for honorary status years earlier, and they'd finally approved it. Presented me with the badge that night, with Thompson looking on. He passed away 6 months later. The actor's voice remained steady, but there was a depth of feeling behind the simple words, so I keep the badge with me as a reminder of him more than anything else. I don't flash it around or use it for special treatment. Just carry it to remember a good man who served his country with distinction. Judge Holloway's expression had changed completely. The last traces of the smug, celebrity-impressed jurist were gone, replaced by genuine respect. Thank you for sharing that story. And again, I apologize for my behavior. Water under the bridge, the actor said, rising to leave. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd of spectators and reporters had gathered, hoping for a glimpse of the famous defendant. Richard approached with the Hendersons in tow. They've invited us for dinner next week, Richard informed the actor, to discuss water management strategies and getting to know each other as neighbors. The actor nodded, then turned to the Hendersons. Bring your property maps and any water surveys you have. We can look them over together. Mrs. Henderson smiled. Thank you. This is not how I expected today to go. Life rarely follows the script, the actor replied with a hint of wry humor. Been my experience that reality is usually more interesting anyway. As they parted ways, Richard walked with the actor toward their car. You handled that well, the attorney observed. Both the case and the aftermath. The actor shrugged slightly. Seemed like the right thing to do. The badge was a nice touch, Richard added with a small smile. I had no idea you carried that with you. Don't usually, the actor admitted. But Thompson's daughter is getting married this weekend. I'm attending the wedding, so I had it cleaned and polished. Just happened to have it with me today. Richard chuckled. Lucky timing. Maybe, the actor agreed. Or maybe Thompson's still looking out for his friends. 1 week later, the actor stood on his porch again, watching the Hendersons' car approach along the private road. The morning sun caught the dust kicked up by their tires, turning it golden in the light. He took a sip from his coffee mug, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. His phone rang inside the house. It would be his daughter, calling to check how things were going with the neighbors. He smiled slightly, looking forward to telling her how a court case had turned into an unexpected friendship. How sometimes the most contentious beginnings led to the most meaningful connections. He took one more moment to appreciate the view, the rolling hills, the clear sky, and the creek that continued to flow as it had for generations before him and would for generations after. Then he turned and went inside to answer the call, ready to share another unexpected chapter in his ongoing story.